Hi. The ninth essay in The Art of Literature is titled On Reputation, and here Schopenhauer continues his thoughts from the previous essay about criticism and applies these thoughts and principles to fame, both lasting fame, which is deserved, and fleeting fame, just popularity among one's immediate contemporaries. The translator, T. Bailey Saunders, omits a rant that Schopenhauer includes in this section against Hegel. I have tracked down another translation of that passage, and I will include it here as a bonus at the end of the video, so watch through to the end for that, please. In this first section of the essay, Schopenhauer begins with a metaphor of comets, planets, and stars, and he also details the role that envy and modesty play in matters of reputation. Here's what he writes. Writers may be classified as meteors, planets, and fixed stars. A meteor makes a striking effect for a moment. You look up and cry there, and it is gone forever. Planets and wandering stars last a much longer time. They often outshine the fixed stars and are confounded with them by the inexperienced. But this is only because they are near. It is not long before they must yield their place. Nay, the light they give is reflected only, and the sphere of their influence is confined to their own orbit, their contemporaries. Their path is one of change and movement, and with the circuit of a few years their tale is told. Fixed stars are the only ones that are constant. Their position in the firmament is secure. They shine with a light of their own. Their effect today is the same as it was yesterday, because, having no parallax, their appearance does not alter with a difference in our standpoint. They belong not to one system, one nation only, but to the universe. And just because they are so very far away, it is usually many years before their light is visible to the inhabitants of this earth. We have seen in the previous chapter that where a man's merits are of a high order, it is difficult for him to win reputation, because the public is uncritical and lacks discernment. But another and no less serious hindrance to fame comes from the envy it has to encounter. For even in the lowest kinds of work, envy balks even the beginnings of a reputation, and never ceases to cleave to it up to the last. How great a part is played by envy in the wicked ways of the world! Ariosto is right in saying that the dark side of our mortal life predominates, so full it is of this evil. Questa assai più oscuro che serena vita mortal tutta d'invidia piena. This life of mortals far more gloomy than cheerful, completely full of envy. For envy is the moving spirit of that secret and informal, though flourishing alliance everywhere made by mediocrity against individual eminence, no matter of what kind. In his own sphere of work, no one will allow another to be distinguished. He is an intruder who cannot be tolerated. If anyone excels among us, let him go and excel elsewhere. This is the universal password of the second rate. In addition, then, to the rarity of true merit, and the difficulty it has in being understood and recognized, there is the envy of thousands to be reckoned with, all of them bent on suppressing, nay, on smothering it altogether. No one is taken for what he is, but for what others make of him. And this is the handle used by mediocrity to keep down distinction, by not letting it come up as long as that can possibly be prevented. There are two ways of behaving in regard to merit, either to have some of one's own, or to refuse any to others. The latter method is more convenient, and so it is generally adopted. As envy is a mere sign of deficiency, so to envy merit argues the lack of it. My excellent Balthazar Gracian has given a very fine account of this relation between envy and merit in a lengthy fable, which may be found in his Discreto under the heading Hombre de Ostentación. He describes all the birds as meeting together and conspiring against the peacock because of his magnificent feathers. If, said the magpie, we could only manage to put a stop to the cursed parading of his tail, there would soon be an end of his beauty, for what is not seen is as good as what does not exist. This explains how modesty came to be a virtue. It was invented only as a protection against envy. That there have always been rascals to urge this virtue, and to rejoice heartily over the bashfulness of a man of merit, has been shown at length in my chief work. In Lichtenberg's miscellaneous writings I find this sentence quoted: "Modesty should be the virtue of those who possess no other." Goethe has a well-known saying which offends many people: "It is only knaves who are modest, nur die Lumpen sind bescheiden." But it has its prototype in Cervantes, who includes in his Journey up Parnassus certain rules of conduct for poets, and amongst them the following: "Everyone whose verse shows him to be a poet should have a high opinion of himself, relying on the proverb that he is a knave who thinks himself one." And Shakespeare, in many of his sonnets, which gave him the only opportunity he had of speaking of himself, declares with a confidence equal to his ingenuousness that what he writes is immortal. Footnote: Collier, one of his critical editors, in his introduction to the sonnets, remarks upon this point. In many of them are to be found most remarkable indications of self-confidence and of assurance in the immortality of his verses, and in this respect the author's opinion was constant and uniform. He never scruples to express it, and perhaps there is no writer of ancient or modern times who, for the quantity of such writings left behind him, has so frequently or so strongly declared that what he had produced in this department of poetry the world would not willingly let die. A method of underrating good work often used by envy, in reality, however, only the obverse side of it, consists in the dishonorable and unscrupulous laudation of the bad. For no sooner does bad work gain currency than it draws attention from the good. But however effective this method may be for a while, especially if it is applied on a large scale, the day of reckoning comes at last, and the fleeting credit given to bad work is paid off by the lasting discredit which overtakes those who abjectly praised it. Hence these critics prefer to remain anonymous. A like fate threatens, though more remotely, those who depreciate and censure good work, and consequently many are too prudent to attempt it. But there is another way, and when a man of eminent merit appears, the first effect he produces is often only to pique all his rivals, just as the peacock's tail offended the birds. This reduces them to a deep silence, and their silence is so unanimous that it savors of preconcertion. Their tongues are all paralyzed. It is the silentium levoris described by Seneca. This malicious silence, which is technically known as ignoring, may for a long time interfere with the growth of reputation. If, as happens in the higher walks of learning, where a man's immediate audience is wholly composed of rival workers and professed students, who then form the channel of his fame, the greater public is obliged to use its suffrage without being able to examine the matter for itself. And if, in the end, that malicious silence is broken in upon by the voice of praise, it will be but seldom that this happens entirely apart from some ulterior aim, pursued by those who thus manipulate justice. For, as Goethe says in the Westostlicher Divan, a man can get no recognition either from many persons or from only one, unless it is to publish abroad the critic's own discernment. Denn es ist kein Anerkennen, weder vieler noch des einen, wenn es nicht am Tage fördert, wo man selbst was möchte scheinen. For there is no recognition from the many or just from you, if it can't succeed in showing what you yourself would like to do. In this first section, Schopenhauer begins with this metaphor of writers may be compared to meteors, planets, or fixed stars. That is, meteors shine brightly, burn out almost immediately. Just almost as you're looking at them, they completely disappear and lose their interest. Planets move more slowly across the sky, but it is their very nature to change. And he has a nice sort of extension of this metaphor. They only shine with reflected light and in a limited sphere, and soon they're gone. They disappear over the horizon. They're no longer visible. But the truly excellent writers, the high-quality writers, the ones who become canon, we might say, are like the fixed stars. And like the fixed stars, they have no parallax. The position you occupy on the Earth makes no difference to their actual appearance in the sky because of their distance. And the nice thing he's able to do there is he's able to use that to account for the way in which the genuinely great authors, think Homer or Shakespeare, are ones who are appreciated anew as excellent at every stage of human history. He also says, like the fixed stars, the light from them is only seen many years later because of their immense distance from us. This section also includes Schopenhauer's thoughts on the hazard that envy plays in holding back the reputation that excellent work deserves and might eventually win. He has many literary examples and comments from different thinkers. He quotes some of his favorite thinkers here as well. He also observes here that people will have either merit, they will deserve praise and reputation, or they will have envy. And the suggestion is these are mutually exclusive. If you have what it takes to deserve a good reputation, you have no need of envy. And if you are aware of having no merit yourself, whether consciously or unconsciously, you will turn to envy, perhaps, as a way of compensating. So these are the two categories into which people fall in thinking about genuine excellence. Humility, he says, may originally have developed as a kind of dodge, a defense against envy for the great people. Great people will profess modesty and humility in order to tamp down the envy of lesser people looking at them. And he notes here also, I think correctly, even in our own time especially, a principle that applies to us as well, that one of the tactics of the envious to drag down the good is by praising bad and inferior work, trying to elevate the bad, and by placing it on the same level with the good, pull the good down. I think we see that in our own time especially. In the next section, Schopenhauer will talk about how and why people praise excellent work and why a lasting reputation will always take a long time to build. Here's what he writes. The credit you allow to another man engaged in work similar to your own, or akin to it, must at bottom be withdrawn from yourself, and you can praise him only at the expense of your own claims. Accordingly, mankind is in itself not at all inclined to award praise and reputation. It is more disposed to blame and find fault, whereby it indirectly praises itself. If, notwithstanding this, praise is won from mankind, some extraneous motive must prevail. I am not here referring to the disgraceful way in which mutual friends will puff one another into a reputation. Outside of that, an effectual motive is supplied by the feeling that, next to the merit of doing something oneself, comes that of correctly appreciating and recognizing what others have done. This accords with the threefold division of heads drawn up by Hesiod and afterwards by Machiavelli. There are, says the latter, in the capacities of mankind, three varieties. One man will understand a thing by himself, another so far as it is explained to him, a third neither of himself nor when it is put clearly before him. He then who abandons hope of making good his claims to the first class will be glad to seize the opportunity of taking a place in the second. It is almost wholly owing to this state of things that merit may always rest assured of ultimately meeting with recognition. To this also is due the fact that when the value of a work has once been recognized and may no longer be concealed or denied, all men vie in praising and honoring it, simply because they are conscious of thereby doing themselves an honor. They act in the spirit of Xenophon's remark, "He must be a wise man who knows what is wise." So when they see that the prize of original merit is forever out of their reach, they hasten to possess themselves of that which comes second best, the correct appreciation of it. Here it happens as with an army which has been forced to yield, when, just as previously every man wanted to be foremost in the fight, so now every man tries to be foremost in running away. They all hurry forward to offer their applause to one who is now recognized to be worthy of praise, in virtue of a recognition, as a rule unconscious, of that law of homogeneity which I mentioned in the last chapter, so that it may seem as though their way of thinking and looking at things were homogeneous with that of the celebrated man, and that they may at least save the honor of their literary taste, since nothing else is left them. From this it is plain that, whereas it is very difficult to win fame, it is not hard to keep it when once attained, and also that a reputation which comes quickly does not last very long, for here too, quod cito fit, cito perit. It is obvious that if the ordinary average man can easily recognize, and the rival workers willingly acknowledge, the value of any performance, it will not stand very much above the capacity of either of them to achieve it for themselves. Tantum quisque laudat, quantum se posse sperat imitari. A man will praise a thing only so far as he hopes to be able to imitate it himself. Further, it is a suspicious sign if a reputation comes quickly, for an application of the laws of homogeneity will show that such a reputation is nothing but the direct applause of the multitude. What this means may be seen by a remark once made by Phocion, when he was interrupted in a speech by the loud cheers of the mob. Turning to his friends who were standing close by, he asked, "Have I made a mistake and said something stupid?" Contrarily, a reputation that is to last a long time must be slow in maturing, and the centuries of its duration have generally to be bought at the cost of contemporary praise. For that which is to keep its position so long must be of a perfection difficult to attain, and even to recognize this perfection requires men who are not always to be found, and never in numbers sufficiently great to make themselves heard, whereas envy is always on the watch, and doing its best to smother their voice. But with moderate talent, which soon meets with recognition, there is the danger that those who possess it will outlive both it and themselves, so that a youth of fame may be followed by an old age of obscurity. In the case of great merit, on the other hand, a man may remain unknown for many years, but make up for it later on by attaining a brilliant reputation. And if it should be that this comes only after he is no more, well, he is to be reckoned amongst those of whom Jean-Paul says that extreme unction is their baptism. He may console himself by thinking of the saints, who also are canonized only after they are dead. Thus what Mahlmann said so well in his Herodes holds good. Translator's note: August Mahlmann, journalist, poet, and story writer, his Herodes for Bethlehem is a parody of Kotzebue's Hussiten for Naumburg. Thus what Mahlmann has said so well in his Herodes holds good. In this world, truly great work never pleases at once, and the God set up by the multitude keeps his place on the altar but a short time. Ich denke, das wahre Große in der Welt ist immer nur das, was nicht gleich gefällt, und wenn der Pöbel zum Gotte weiht, der steht auf dem Altar nur kurze Zeit. What's truly great in the world, I would say, is always that which we hate right away, and he whom the rabble would deify is holy for only the blink of an eye. It is worth mention that this rule is most directly confirmed in the case of pictures, where, as connoisseurs well know, the greatest masterpieces are not the first to attract attention. If they make a deep impression, it is not after one, but only after repeated inspection. But then they excite more and more admiration every time they are seen. Moreover, the chances that any given work will be quickly and rightly appreciated depend upon two conditions. Firstly, the character of the work, whether high or low, in other words, easy or difficult to understand, and secondly, the kind of public it attracts, whether large or small. This latter condition is, no doubt, in most instances, a corollary of the former, but it also partly depends upon whether the work in question admits, like books and musical compositions, of being produced in great numbers. By the compound action of these two conditions, achievements which serve no materially useful end, and these alone are under consideration here, will vary in regard to the chances they have of meeting with timely recognition and due appreciation, and the order of precedence, beginning with those who have the greatest chance, will be somewhat as follows: acrobats, circus riders, ballet dancers, jugglers, actors, singers, musicians, composers, poets, both the last on account of the multiplication of their works, architects, painters, sculptors, philosophers. The last place of all is unquestionably taken by philosophers, because their works are meant not for entertainment, but for instruction, and because they presume some knowledge on the part of the reader, and require him to make an effort of his own to understand them. This makes their public extremely small, and causes their fame to be more remarkable for its length than for its breadth. And in general, it may be said that the possibility of a man's fame lasting a long time stands in almost inverse ratio with the chance that it will be early in making its appearance, so that, as regards length of fame, the above order of precedence may be reversed. But then the poet and the composer will come in the end to stand on the same level as the philosopher, since, when once a work is committed to writing, it is possible to preserve it to all time. However, the first place still belongs by right to the philosopher, because of the much greater scarcity of good work in this sphere, and the high importance of it, and also because of the possibility it offers of an almost perfect translation into any language. Sometimes indeed it happens that a philosopher's fame outlives even his works themselves, as has happened with Thales, Empedocles, Heraclitus, Democritus, Parmenides, Epicurus, and many others. My remarks are, as I have said, confined to achievements that are not of any material use. Work that serves some practical end, or ministers directly to some pleasure of the senses, will never have any difficulty in being duly appreciated. No first-rate pastry cook could long remain obscure in any town, to say nothing of having to appeal to posterity. Schopenhauer begins this section by noting that self-regard, our sort of innate admiration for ourselves that each of us has, makes people more inclined to blame than to praise, that they find things that are dissimilar from themselves, especially if they find it to be superior to them, and they don't like it. They don't wish to admire it. He quotes Machiavelli on these three types of men: those who can understand a thing on their own, those who can understand it when they are instructed about it, and people who can never understand it even with instruction. I'm reminded here of something I was told many years ago. I think of as a kind of Buddhist equivalent to this threefold division. I was told that might say that in the gardens of Zen, there are three types of men. There is the sage who knows Zen. There are the attendants who do not know Zen but who serve those who know Zen. And then in the third category, there are rice bags and coat hangers, people who just sort of occupy space, consume food, that the clothes drape upon them, but they have no clue. They have not even the slightest idea of what they're missing. Perhaps Schopenhauer and Machiavelli both here are intending something similar. When Schopenhauer's use of this threefold division, though, is to say many people, when they realize that they're not in the highest group, that they can't understand by themselves, that they can't generate great art, they will flock to group two. And this is what makes it more likely that excellent work will eventually be recognized. People can't understand by themselves, appreciate great work, but if somebody would tell me what great art looked like, then I could admire it myself. And this accounts for a good deal of the reputation, and probably is a good thing, because it means that excellent work that would not have been recognized except by a very few, might actually achieve a kind of popular acceptance and general praise. People also, he says, praise excellent work merely in order to show themselves to be people of quality, people of good judgment. They want to be like the people who do genuinely understand and praise it. And he brings in here an idea that was introduced in the previous chapter, the previous essay, the law of homogeneity. People admire what is like themselves. If they see a thing like themselves, they will admire it, be more inclined to admire it just for that reason. And it's here that we have the very amusing story of the ancient orator Phocion, who, on hearing the crowd applaud something he'd said, instantly looked to his friends and compatriots and said, well, this is bad. What did I say that led these idiots to suddenly start cheering and to admire me? I must have said something stupid and wrong in order to earn that kind of admiration from these kind of people. Schopenhauer notes also here that we should expect deserved and lasting reputation to take a long time to develop. I especially like the line that he quotes that for some people, extreme unction is their baptism. That's the sacrament of the anointing of the sick, of the dying. So on their deathbed, they receive a sacrament rather than preparing them for eternal life, for the next life. It actually is their baptism into the world of fame that they genuinely deserve. So not until they die do they really sort of enter into their own proper inheritance and recognition from the culture. To be recognized, he notes, two factors go into the fame or recognition of excellent work. One, the difficulty of understanding it. Is it easy or hard to grasp? And the size of its audience. And he also mentions here what we might call scalability, right? How reproducible is the work? Into how many people's hands, before how many people's eyes can it be placed? In this case, he's going to say poetry has a bit of an advantage over something like philosophy, where the philosophy requires a great deal of prior education and careful attention and leisure in order to do. Anybody can read poetry, can pick up and read it, or anybody can perhaps look at and begin to appreciate the principles of painting or of sculpture. So there is, both of these factors go into the length of time it takes for something to acquire a reputation. And he gives this interesting ranking of professions from the sort of easiest to achieve fame, easiest and quickest to be appreciated. Acrobats apparently occupy the lowest position, along with jugglers, up to the historians, the sculptors, the philosophers, the people whose work is difficult to understand and appeals to a very narrow audience. He notes at the end of this section that the rules he's been articulating so far apply only to what we might say are useless things which have no practical relevance. And another great pithy, sort of witty observation that a first-rate pastry chef will immediately be recognized and valued in his or her own time. There's no danger of such a person being obscure and only appreciated 20 or 50 years after his death, right? The fact that he makes things that are immediately desirable and that are pleasant to everyone makes him, the toast of the town, very popular. He has no difficulty in having his excellence appreciated, his particular kind of excellence. It's the excellences of culture and of intellect that are going to be the most difficult to achieve the kind of fame and reputation that they deserve. In the following section, Schopenhauer is going to take up the question of false fame, and also what it means to say that an artist or an intellectual is ahead of his time. So here's what he writes. Under fame of rapid growth is also to be reckoned fame of a false and artificial kind, where, for instance, a book is worked into a reputation by means of unjust praise, the help of friends, corrupt criticism, prompting from above, and collusion from below. All this tells upon the multitude, which is rightly presumed to have no power of judging for itself. This sort of fame is like a swimming bladder. By its aid a heavy body may keep afloat. It bears up for a certain time, long or short, according as the bladder is well sewed up and blown, but still the air comes out gradually, and the body sinks. This is the inevitable fate of all works which are famous by reason of something outside of themselves. False praise dies away, collusion comes to an end, critics declare their reputation ungrounded, it vanishes, and is replaced by so much the greater contempt. Contrarily, a genuine work, which, having the source of fame in itself, can kindle admiration afresh in every age, resembles a body of low specific gravity, which always keeps up of its own accord, and so goes floating down the stream of time. Men of great genius, whether their work be in poetry, philosophy, or art, stand in all ages like isolated heroes, keeping up single-handed a desperate struggling against the onslaught of an army of opponents. Translator's note. At this point, Schopenhauer interrupts the thread of his discourse to speak at length upon an example of false fame. Those who are at all acquainted with the philosopher's views will not be surprised to find that the writer thus held up to scorn is Hegel, and readers of the other volumes in this series will, with the translator, have had by now quite enough of the subject. The passage is therefore omitted. Is not this characteristic of the miserable nature of mankind? The dullness, grossness, perversity, silliness, and brutality of by far the greater part of the race are always an obstacle to the efforts of the genius, whatever be the method of his art. They so form that hostile army to which at last he has to succumb. Let the isolated champion achieve what he may. It is slow to be acknowledged. It is late in being appreciated, and then only on the score of authority. It may easily fall into neglect again, at any rate for a while. Ever afresh it finds itself opposed by false, shallow, and insipid ideas, which are better suited to that large majority that so generally hold the field. Though the critic may step forth and say, like Hamlet when he held up the two portraits to his wretched mother, "Have you eyes? Have you eyes?" Alas, they have none. When I watch the behavior of a crowd of people in the presence of some great master's work, and mark the manner of their applause, they often remind me of trained monkeys in a show. The monkeys' gestures are, no doubt, much like those of men, but now and again they betray that the real inward spirit of these gestures is not in them. Their irrational nature peeps out. It is often said of a man that he is in advance of his age, and it follows from the above remarks that this must be taken to mean that he is in advance of humanity in general. Just because of this fact, a genius makes no direct appeal except to those who are too rare to allow of their ever forming a numerous body at any one period. If he is in this respect not particularly favored by fortune, he will be misunderstood by his own age. In other words, he will remain unaccepted until time gradually brings together the voices of those few persons who are capable of judging a work of such high character. Then posterity will say, "This man was in advance of his age," instead of "in advance of humanity," because humanity will be glad to lay the burden of its own faults upon a single epoch. Hence, if a man has been superior to his own age, he would also have been superior to any other, provided that, in that age, by some rare and happy chance, a few just men, capable of judging in the sphere of his achievements, had been born at the same time with him, just as when, according to a beautiful Indian myth, Vishnu becomes incarnate as a hero, so too Brahma at the same time appears as the singer of his deeds, and hence Valmiki, Vyasa, and Kalidasa are incarnations of Brahma. In this sense, it may be said that every immortal work puts its age to the proof, whether or no it will be able to recognize the merit of it. As a rule, the men of any age stand such a test no better than the neighbors of Philemon and Baucis, who expelled the deities they failed to recognize. Accordingly, the right standard for judging the intellectual worth of any generation is supplied not by the great minds that make their appearance in it, for their capacities are the work of nature, and the possibility of cultivating them a matter of chance circumstance, but by the way in which contemporaries receive their works, whether, I mean, they give their applause soon and with a will, or late and in niggardly fashion, or leave it to be bestowed altogether by posterity. This last fate will be especially reserved for works of a high character, for the happy chance mentioned above will be all the more certain not to come, in proportion as there are few to appreciate the kind of work done by great minds. Herein lies the immeasurable advantage possessed by poets in respect of reputation, because their work is accessible to almost everyone. If it had been possible for Sir Walter Scott to be read and criticized by only some 100 persons, perhaps in his lifetime any common scribbler would have been preferred to him, and afterwards, when he had taken his proper place, it would also have been said in his honor that he was in advance of his age. But if envy, dishonesty, and the pursuit of personal aims are added to the incapacity of those 100 persons who, in the name of their generation, are called upon to pass judgment on a work, then indeed it meets with the same sad fate as attends a suitor who pleads before a tribunal of judges, one and all corrupt. In corroboration of this, we find that the history of literature generally shows all those who made knowledge and insight their goal to have remained unrecognized and neglected, whilst those who paraded with the vain show of it received the admiration of their contemporaries, together with the emoluments. The effectiveness of an author turns chiefly upon his getting the reputation that he should be read, but by practicing various arts, by the operation of chance, and by certain natural affinities, this reputation is quickly won by 100 worthless people, while a worthy writer may come by it very slowly and tardily. The former possess friends to help them, for the rabble is always a numerous body, which holds well together. The latter has nothing but enemies, because intellectual superiority is everywhere and under all circumstances the most hateful thing in the world, and especially to bunglers in the same line of work, who want to pass for something themselves. Footnote: if the professors of philosophy should chance to think that I am here hinting at them and the tactics they have for more than 30 years pursued towards my works, they have hit the nail upon the head. Second footnote: as a rule, the quantity and quality of the public of a given work stand in inverse proportion. Therefore, for instance, the value of a poet's work cannot in the least be deduced from its numerous editions. This being so, it is a prime condition for doing any great work, any work which is to outlive its own age, that a man pay no heed to his contemporaries, their views and opinions, and the praise or blame which they bestow. This condition is, however, fulfilled of itself when a man really does anything great, and it is fortunate that it is so. For if, in producing such a work, he were to look to the general opinion or the judgment of his colleagues, they would lead him astray at every step. Hence, if a man wants to go down to posterity, he must withdraw from the influence of his own age. This will, of course, generally mean that he must also renounce any influence upon it, and be ready to buy centuries of fame by foregoing the applause of his contemporaries. For when any new and wide-ranging truth comes into the world, and if it is new it must be paradoxical, an obstinate stand will be made against it as long as possible. Nay, people will continue to deny it even after they slacken their opposition and are almost convinced of its truth. Meanwhile, it goes on quietly working its way, and, like an acid, undermining everything around it. From time to time a crash is heard, the old error comes tottering to the ground, and suddenly the new fabric of thought stands revealed, as though it were a monument just uncovered. Everyone recognizes and admires it. To be sure, this all comes to pass, for the most part, very slowly. As a rule, people discover a man to be worth listening to only after he is gone. Their "hear, hear" resounds when the orator has left the platform. Works of the ordinary type meet with a better fate. Arising as they do in the course of, and in connection with, the general advance in contemporary culture, they are in close alliance with the spirit of their age. In other words, just those opinions which happen to be prevalent at the time. They aim at suiting the needs of the moment. If they have any merit, it is soon recognized, and they gain currency as books which reflect the latest ideas. Justice, nay, more than justice, is done to them. They afford little scope for envy, since, as was said above, a man will praise a thing only so far as he hopes to be able to imitate it himself. But those rare works which are destined to become the property of all mankind, and to live for centuries, are, at their origin, too far in advance of the point at which culture happens to stand, and on that very account foreign to it and the spirit of their own time. They neither belong to it, nor are they in any connection with it, and hence they excite no interest in those who are dominated by it. They belong to another, a higher stage of culture, and a time that is still far off. Their course is related to that of ordinary works as the orbit of Uranus to the orbit of Mercury. For the moment they get no justice done to them. People are at a loss how to treat them, so they leave them alone, and go their own snail's pace for themselves. Does the worm see the eagle as it soars aloft? In this section, Schopenhauer compares the praise that one receives from one's contemporaries, people in one's own time, to a leaky swim bladder. Think of an inflated tube that one would use to float or swim in the water. And he says it will keep up your body, but inevitably it begins to leak, and as soon as enough air is gone from it, the heavy body that it's holding up will begin to sink. And that's a nice little metaphor. I think it works even better for us who are perhaps as familiar or more familiar with those inflatable swim toys, which never hold on to their air. They work, but only temporarily. The very nature of them is that the flotation they provide is for an hour or two only. He contrasts this with a work that has its true excellence within itself. And think of, say, a play like Shakespeare's King Lear or Othello. The excellence is in the work itself. And in this sense, it's like a body with a low specific gravity. It floats like a cork in water. It will float forever under its own power without this sort of a gradual decline of its buoyancy. It's in this section here that we have the omitted passage about Hegel, and I'll record and attach to the end of this video my reading and analysis of the parts that were left out. I think you'll like it, so please do stick around for that. He notes he has this kind of unpleasant comparison of ordinary sort of vulgar people praising a great work. Think of people at a museum admiring something that is quite extraordinary. He compares them to monkeys, right? Sort of clapping because they've been trained to clap, or imitating human gestures. That's perhaps fits in with Schopenhauer's overall feel, but certainly seems getting close to the edge of being cruel, I think. Especially since he said earlier that he would like to see, it actually is a good thing that people who don't have good judgment and discernment will actually praise good works, that we can have good works still around, can achieve the kind of admiration and the sort of cultural impact that it ought to have. He analyzes the idea, the expression of being ahead of your time. What does it mean to say as man is not of this age, that he's ahead of his time? In a sense, it means ahead of all of us, ahead of all times, ahead of the entire human race. Part of what this means is that every great artist speaks to every age, not just to his own. He speaks to all humans at all places and times. He hits on something eternal. Right. And for me, it's always been King Lear. It's always been Shakespeare. He seems to hit something, he touches strings in the human heart that all of us can feel, even well outside of his own Elizabethan context. We don't have to be British. We don't have to be familiar with, more than just familiar with the social context of the European courts about which he writes, in order to understand and appreciate the human factors, the betrayal, the love, the loss, etc. And so he notes, this is, I think, very good advice. The way we should judge an age, an era or a culture, is not by its greatest artists, but by how those great artists were treated by the rest of the people. What kind of recognition did they give to their great artists? Did they hold up and elevate him? That says a great deal about the age, and shows it to be an age of sort of widespread excellent judgment. If the greatest among them were always obscure or were despised, were unpopular, that should redound to the shame of the age. And again, for more about that and Schopenhauer's criticism of Hegel, see the video, the additional passage at the end of this video. He suggests, I think, here that every artist will have to choose whether he wishes to earn praise from posterity, from sort of the eternal human race, or praise from his contemporaries. You can do what's popular, or you can do what's good. And you're going to have to choose one. You can't have both. You can't win the plaudits of both, it seems, except in exceptionally rare cases. And he has an attack here in the footnote on philosophers who derided and diminished his own work, and says, if you think I'm talking about you, yes, I absolutely am. This is Schopenhauer here writing at the end of his career when he's achieved, I think, or is about to achieve a certain amount of popular success and admiration. These are from his essays late in his life. Having gone through 30 or 40 years of being criticized, insulted, ignored, found inferior to Hegel, to Fichte and the Hegelians by many in the philosophical establishment. We do and should expect great artists in every age to be aloof from their own culture and their age and its tastes. This is the very character of excellent work in art and in the intellect. And his metaphor, again, here reminds me of some passages from Nietzsche in Twilight of the Idols. The excellence of their great work will eat away like acid at common opinion until it collapses, and we can sort of imagine sort of the pillars falling of popular taste as the great effect of the work of genius does its slow work over time in collapsing the received opinions, the popular fads of the day. So I like that idea very much, that sort of the power of it is very, very gradual and is only going to emerge over a great deal of time. In the next section, Schopenhauer will discuss how and why excellence is so rare, and how there is this inverse relationship between contemporary reputation during your own lifetime and fame through posterity, the kind of admiration you earn from people over time by the inner quality of your work. And here's what he writes. Of the number of books written in any language, about 1 in 100,000 forms a part of its real and permanent literature. What a fate this one book has to endure before it outstrips those 100,000 and gains its due place of honor. Such a book is the work of an extraordinary and eminent mind, and therefore it is specifically different from the others, a fact which sooner or later becomes manifest. Let no one fancy that things will ever improve in this respect. No, the miserable constitution of humanity never changes, though it may, to be sure, take somewhat varying forms with every generation. A distinguished mind seldom has its full effect in the lifetime of its possessor, because at bottom it is completely and properly understood only by minds already akin to it. As it is a rare thing for even one man out of many millions to tread the path that leads to immortality, he must, of necessity, be very lonely. The journey to posterity lies through a horribly dreary region, like the Libyan desert, of which, as is well known, no one has any idea who has not seen it for himself. Meanwhile, let me before all things recommend the traveler to take light baggage with him, otherwise he will have to throw away too much on the road. Let him never forget the words of Baltasar Gracian, Lo bueno si breve, dos veces bueno. Good work is doubly good if it is short. This advice is specially applicable to my own countrymen. Compared with the short span of time they live, men of great intellect are like huge buildings, standing on a small plot of ground. The size of the building cannot be seen by anyone just in front of it, nor, for an analogous reason, can the greatness of a genius be estimated while he lives. But when a century has passed, the world recognizes it and wishes him back again. If the perishable son of time has produced an imperishable work, how short his own life seems compared with that of his child. He is like Samela, or Maya, a mortal mother who gave birth to an immortal son, or, contrarily, he is like Achilles in regard to Thetis. What a contrast there is between what is fleeting and what is permanent. The short span of a man's life, his necessitous, afflicted, unstable existence, will seldom allow of his seeing even the beginning of his immortal child's brilliant career. Nor will the father himself be taken for that which he really is. It may be said indeed that a man whose fame comes after him is the reverse of a nobleman who is preceded by it. However, the only difference that it ultimately makes to a man to receive his fame at the hands of contemporaries rather than from posterity is that, in the former case, his admirers are separated from him by space, and in the latter, by time. For even in the case of contemporary fame, a man does not, as a rule, see his admirers actually before him. Reverence cannot endure close proximity. It almost always dwells at some distance from its object, and in the presence of the person revered, it melts like butter in the sun. Accordingly, if a man is celebrated with his contemporaries, 9/10 of those amongst whom he lives will let their esteem be guided by his rank and fortune, and the remaining 10th may perhaps have a dull consciousness of his high qualities because they have heard about him from remote quarters. There is a fine Latin letter of Petrarch's on this incompatibility between reverence and the presence of the person, and between fame and life. It comes second in his Epistolae Familiaris, and it is addressed to Thomas Messinensis. He there observes, amongst other things, that the learned men of his age all made it a rule to think little of a man's writings if they had even once seen him. Some distance, then, is essential if a famous man is to be recognized and revered. It does not matter whether it is distance of space or of time. It is true that he may sometimes hear of his fame in the one case, but never in the other. But still, genuine and great merit may make up for this by confidently anticipating its posthumous fame. Nay, he who produces some really great thought is conscious of his connection with coming generations at the very moment he conceives it, so that he feels the extension of his existence through centuries and thus lives with posterity as well as for it. And when, after enjoying a great man's work, we are seized with admiration for him and wish him back, so that we might see and speak with him and have him in our possession, this desire of ours is not unrequited, for he too has had his longing for that posterity which will grant the recognition, honor, gratitude, and love denied by envious contemporaries. If intellectual works of the highest order are not allowed their due until they come before the tribunal of posterity, a contrary fate is prepared for certain brilliant errors which proceed from men of talent, and appear with an air of being well grounded. These errors are defended with so much acumen and learning that they actually become famous with their own age, and maintain their position at least during their author's lifetime. Of this sort are many false theories and wrong criticisms, also poems and works of art which exhibit some false taste or mannerism favored by contemporary prejudice. They gain reputation and currency simply because no one is yet forthcoming who knows how to refute them or otherwise prove their falsity, and when he appears, as he usually does, in the next generation, the glory of these works is brought to an end. Posthumous judges, be their decision favorable to the appellant or not, form the proper court for quashing the verdict of contemporaries. That is why it is so difficult and so rare to be victorious alike in both tribunals. The unfailing tendency of time to correct knowledge and judgment should always be kept in view as a means of allaying anxiety whenever any grievous error appears, whether in art or science or practical life, and gains ground, or when some false and thoroughly perverse policy of movement is undertaken and receives applause at the hands of men. No one should be angry, or still less despondent, but simply imagine that the world has already abandoned the error in question, and now only requires time and experience to recognize of its own accord that which a clear vision detected at the first glance. When the facts themselves are eloquent of a truth, there is no need to rush to its aid with words, for time will give it 1,000 tongues. How long it may be before they speak will of course depend upon the difficulty of the subject and the plausibility of the error, but come they will, and often it would be of no avail to try to anticipate them. In the worst cases, it will happen with theories as it happens with affairs in practical life, where sham and deception, emboldened by success, advance to greater and greater lengths, until discovery is made almost inevitable. It is just so with theories. Through the blind confidence of the blockheads who broach them, their absurdity reaches such a pitch that at last it is obvious even to the dullest eye. We may thus say to such people, "The wilder your statements, the better." There is also some comfort to be found in reflecting upon all the whims and crotchets which had their day, and have now utterly vanished. In style, in grammar, in spelling, there are false notions of this sort which last only 3 or 4 years. But when the errors are on a large scale, while we lament the brevity of human life, we shall in any case do well to lag behind our own age when we see it on a downward path. For there are 2 ways of not keeping on a level with the times. A man may be below it, or he may be above it. In this last section of On Reputation, Schopenhauer begins by noting that perhaps maybe 1 in 100,000 books produced will turn out to be of lasting value, and we should not expect this ratio to change, that it is always going to be the case that a vanishingly small fraction of 1% of all the work that is produced will actually be of such excellent quality that it will stand the test of time. So we would not expect to see the writers on the bestseller lists for any given year or for any given decade to be read by anybody 100 years, 200 years, 500 years from now. It's going to be a very, very rare talent that will sort of carry forward into the admiration of posterity to future generations. There's a theme throughout these last sections of the suffering that the genius or the excellent artist must go through. And this reminds me again very much of Nietzsche. That's a theme, those of you who know Nietzsche, a theme very much in Nietzsche's writings, based upon Nietzsche's own sufferings, in fact, his physical sufferings and psychological sufferings especially. That to be a great artist, to be a genius, is not only to be out of sync with your own time, with your own contemporaries, but it is to suffer. It is to sacrifice for the sake of your art. And he gives this great metaphor of trekking through the Libyan desert. Right. And he's able to extend this metaphor a little bit by saying, my advice to those of you who are planning to do this, if you think there is genius in you, pack light. In other words, value brevity in your words. And he addresses this as a special warning to the Germans. In the German version of this, he does actually mention the Germans specifically, where Saunders renders it as my own countrymen. Same effect, but it seems striking to me that he specifically says, the Germans, people who write in the German language, you guys absolutely have to get brevity as one of your priorities. Think especially here of the contrast between Schopenhauer's writing style and Hegel's and Fichte's and Schelling's and the others. The genius artist, he says, can recognize his own immortal work in his own lifetime. There's a special way in which the genius among us in the realm of the intellect and in art seems to dwell among the gods. He's kind of half a step, already got kind of half a step into eternity, it seems. And he's able to live with a sense of posterity. In a sense, he lives with posterity as well as for posterity. It's not as though, Schopenhauer says, it's not as though the great artist is sort of shooting arrows into the future, just hoping that somebody might pick up on them. He's saying here fairly explicitly that the genuinely great artist, think Shakespeare, think perhaps Goethe, is aware of the fact that, and can almost feel the admiration of future generations for him. He feels himself at home with the times and the people yet to come. I'm not quite sure how to read this, but that seems to be plainly what is in the text and that Saunders gives us from Schopenhauer. There's a nice bit of parallel here where Schopenhauer notes that if you have contemporary fame, what you have is admirers who are separated from you by space. But if you have fame and posterity, this kind of lasting recognition that Shakespeare and others have gotten, you have admirers who are separated from you by time. The interesting note, of course, is that no one is able to revere what is close to him in both space and time. It's simply too familiar. So either we have to be separated by space, right, in which case I admire somebody in my own time but from far away, or we're separated by time. I admire Shakespeare across the centuries between his time and my own. He notes here again the fate of work that achieves great fame and popularity in its own time. It is destined to fade almost immediately after the author's lifetime. There's this great image here of the posthumous judges who will come and who will overturn the verdict of your contemporaries, whether it's for good or for ill. So the suggestion I think here is that the intelligent thing to do is to write for and appeal to those posthumous judges, to write for the ages, if you can at all. In my own mind, I think here of the fate of the reputation of Henri Bergson, a French philosopher who died in 1941, and who was, I think, in his own lifetime and immediately afterwards, lauded across the board, was considered to be one of the greatest philosophers of the 20th century. But by even 30 or 50 years after his death, his star had declined quite rapidly. And I don't expect anybody outside of philosophy, or even 20th century philosophy, to know Bergson. But there's somebody whose star burned very, very bright in his own lifetime and was praised and widely known, who is thought of by virtually nobody today, I think. Maybe a little bit of a revival of his work. But there's one example for me of someone whose work seems to have been overturned by posthumous judges, perhaps also by changes in intellectual life since the end of World War II. So Schopenhauer concludes and says, don't be anxious, right? This is cause for hope and sort of should allay any anxiety or concern that one might feel. Truth and excellence will win in the long run. Okay? And he says, with that in mind, we who see these things clearly might even encourage the kind of over-exaggeration among people who we know are in error, because the more boldly and outrageously they state their false claims, the faster they will burn out, the faster they will be replaced by something which might eventually move closer to the truth. And then there's the final line of this essay, which I think is a great one. There are two ways that you can be out of sync with your times. You can be below them, or, Schopenhauer plainly thinking of himself here, you can be above them. So you might say for every artist, for every intellectual who wants to be excellent, strive to be better than your time. Strive to be above the general level of taste of your place and time. And that will obviously limit your appeal to your contemporaries, but might be the path for you to a genuinely well-earned reputation for excellent work. The next and final essay in the art of literature is titled On Genius, and we will look at that one in the next video. Right now, I invite you to continue watching for my presentation of the missing passage, the 2.5 pages of Schopenhauer's Rant against Hegel that Bailey Saunders omitted. Here it is. In Schopenhauer's essay On Reputation, there's an unusual footnote about halfway through the essay where the translator, T. Bailey Saunders, announces to the readers that he has omitted a lengthy passage critical of Hegel on the grounds that it's just repetitive and not interesting. So I was intrigued by this footnote, so I'd like to share it with you today and share with you from another translation the passage that T. Bailey Saunders chose to omit. I think I have some theories about why it was that he left it out. I'll share those with you, and you may come to your own conclusions as well. Let me begin with T. Bailey Saunders' footnote. This is from this book, The Essays of Schopenhauer, which contains the art of literature. The note I'm thinking of comes on page 87 of that part of the book. Here's the footnote. Translator's note. At this point, Schopenhauer interrupts the thread of his discourse to speak at length upon an example of false fame. Those who are at all acquainted with the philosopher's views will not be surprised to find that the writer thus held up to scorn is Hegel. And readers of the other volumes in this series will, with the translator, have had by now quite enough of the subject. The passage is therefore omitted. So Saunders indicating a big jump in his translation of the essay on reputation. So what I did was I looked this up, and I happen to have this from Cambridge University Press, a much more recent translation of Schopenhauer's works. This is Peroga and Paralipomena, Volume 2. And I have found the passage where Saunders leaves off and where he picks up, and in between is a little bit more than 2 full pages of text pages of this size, so it is quite lengthy. We begin on page 420 of Volume 2 of Peroga, and I think as I read along, I'm going to read this without much commentary, I think you may find the point about 3/4 of the way through where we hit the thing that Saunders truly objected to, and the reason why he was not willing to share it in translation with his audience of English readers of Schopenhauer in the 1890s. Schopenhauer gets a bit salty here, as you'll hear. So here we are. The sentence immediately before the cut is this. On the other hand, genuine works which have the source of their fame in themselves and therefore are capable of rekindling admiration at any time resemble bodies of lower specific gravity, which always keep themselves up by their own means and thus glide down the current of time. Now, here's the cut passage. The entire history of literature of ancient and modern times has produced no example of false fame on a par with that of Hegelian philosophy. Never and nowhere has the entirely bad, the palpably false and absurd, indeed the transparently senseless, and, judging by its manner of delivery, the supremely repulsive and disgusting, been celebrated with such shocking impudence, such brazen cheek, as the highest wisdom and the most magnificent thing the world ever saw, as that utterly worthless pseudo-philosophy. I do not need to say that the sun shone down on all this, but note well that it transpired with complete success among the German public. And therein lies the disgrace. For over a quarter century, this impudently trumped-up fame has passed for genuine, and the bestia triumphante, the triumphant beast, has flourished and reigned in the German Republic of scholarship, so much so that even the few opponents of this silliness do not dare to speak of its miserable progenitor otherwise than as a rare genius and great intellect, and with the profoundest reverence. But what results from this we shall not fail to conclude. Therefore, in the history of literature, this period will always figure as an indelible stain of disgrace on the nation and the age, and will be the ridicule of centuries, and rightly so. Of course, ages like individuals are free to praise the bad and despise the good, but nemesis will reach one as well as the other, and the bell of disgrace will toll. At the time that the chorus of venal churls propagated the fame of that mind-corrupting philosophaster and his unholy, nonsensical scribblings, people would have had to have immediately seen from the whole nature of that praise, if they had been even halfway discerning, that it emanated solely from intent and absolutely not from insight. The translators here, Del Caro and Janeway, by the way, note in a footnote that here Schopenhauer is using the German words Absicht and Einsicht, which are words that he frequently contrasts insight and intent. For it gushed forth immeasurably and in excessive fullness in all 4 directions of the compass, spewing everywhere out of gaping mouths with abandon, without conditions, without respite, without measure, until they ran out of words. And still not satisfied with their own polyphonic paean, these claqueurs, lined up like soldiers, strained their eyes anxiously for any kernel of foreign, uncorrupted praise in order to pluck it and hold it up high. Thus, if some famous man had let himself be strong-armed, wheedled, or tricked into giving the slightest word of approbation, or if it escaped him by accident, or even where an opponent had sweetened his censure with such morsels out of fear or pity, they all fell upon it, plucked it up, and held it aloft triumphantly. It is only intent that praises in this manner, and this is the praise of mercenaries, paid claqueurs, and conspiring literary squad leaders hoping for wages. On the other hand, sincere praise, which emanates merely from insight, bears an entirely different character. It is preceded by what Feuchtersleben has so beautifully formulated. My, how the people have writhed and rejected just to ensure that the good's not respected. For it comes very slowly and late, sporadically and sparingly measured out, weighed in drams and always subject to restrictions, so that the recipient may well say, "It moistens the lips, yet it does not moisten the gums." It's a quote from the Iliad, chapter 22. And yet the dispenser of this praise parts with it only reluctantly, for it is a reward ultimately wrung and involuntarily wrenched from dull, brittle, tough, and envious mediocrity by the greatness of genuine achievements, which can no longer be concealed. It is the laurel worthy of the sweat of nobles, as Klopstock sings. It is as Goethe calls the fruit of that courage which sooner or later conquers the resistance of the dull world. Accordingly, it relates to the impudent praise-mongering of designing men as the hard-to-win, noble and sincere beloved relates to the paid street whore, whose thickly applied white lead and cinnabar would have to have been recognized immediately in Hegel's fame if, as I said earlier, people in Germany were only discerning. Then we would not have, to our national disgrace, the dramatic realization of what Schelling sang. I saw fame's sacred garlands desecrated on a vulgar brow. The Hegelian glory, here selected as an example of false fame, is to be sure a fact without peer, even in Germany, which is why I call on the public libraries to carefully mummify and preserve all documents, as well as the complete works of the philosophaster himself, so too those of his worshippers, for the instruction, warning, and entertainment of posterity, and as a memorial to this age and this country. Nevertheless, if one expands one's gaze and focuses generally on the praise of contemporaries of all times, one will find that, in fact, it is always a whore, prostituted and sullied by 1,000 undeserving men who have had her. Who could still desire such a wench? Who would want to take pride in her favor? Who would not scorn her? On the other hand, fame in posterity is a proud, coy beauty who gives herself only to the worthy, the victor, and the rare hero. That's how it is. And from this, incidentally, we can conclude how badly off must be this species of bipeds, since generations, indeed centuries, are required before a handful of minds is gathered together from its hundreds of millions who are capable of distinguishing the good from the bad, genuine from spurious, gold from copper, and who accordingly are referred to as the tribunal of posterity. For them, an additional favorable circumstance is that the irreconcilable envy of incompetence and the intentional flattery of churlishness are silenced, allowing insight to speak its piece. That is where the omitted passage from T. Bailey Saunders leaves off, and he picks up again in the following paragraph. So that is from the Adrian Del Caro and Christopher Janeway translation of Perugia and Paralipomena from Cambridge University Press. I can recommend this, and I'll put a link to it in the description below if you'd like to look up a copy for yourself. I think I can think of the reasons why Saunders left this out. One, it is very long, it is very repetitive, it is just exceedingly violent in its rhetoric against Hegel, in some ways, and entertaining perhaps, but way over the top. Oh my gosh. The part, I think, and you caught it as well, was the comparison of the praise from one's contemporary as a cheap street whore. Like, who would take pride in being admired or receiving her favors? Everybody else has had her. So I suspect that T. Bailey Saunders, translating in the 1890s, found this not just to be repetitive, but also to be in very poor taste and not fitting for his reading public. Even the more open-minded and free-thinking ones would, I think, object to that kind of language. And maybe we have to wait for a 21st century translation to get the sort of free expression that Schopenhauer was willing to allow himself in his abuse and insulting of Hegel. So calling upon his works to be mummified as a sort of monument to the folly of his time and his place, and even a quarter century of popularity for Hegel's writings is an indelible stain upon the national conscience, a mark of poor taste, etc., etc. So I hope you enjoyed that. It certainly was something a little bit more intense from Schopenhauer here. So that's it for this video. Thanks for watching today. Goodbye.